The letter arrived on a day when the sun scorched the earth, burning through the thin paper as Margaret Rose held it to the light. Her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness as she read the confirmation that Benjamin Atwood had accepted her as his mail-order bride. Soon she would leave Boston behind for the untamed frontier of Silver Creek, Wyoming territory, a place she'd never been, to marry a man she'd never met. Margaret had just turned 22, and her prospects in Boston had dwindled to nothing after her father's death left the family destitute. Her mother and younger sisters now depended on her making a good match. The advertisement in the matrimonial news had seemed like providence. Successful rancher seeks educated, respectable woman as wife, must be hardy enough for frontier life. Position offers security and respect. The stagecoach journey west took nearly 2 weeks. Margaret watched as civilization gradually gave way to the rugged landscape of the frontier. Each mile that passed brought her closer to her new life and further from everything she had ever known. The year was 1877, and the West was still wild despite the passing of a decade since the Civil War. The railroad had connected much of the country, but Silver Creek remained isolated enough that Margaret had to travel the final leg by stagecoach, bouncing over rutted trails with nothing but her valise, a trunk of belongings, and her pride to sustain her. "First time out west, miss?" the grizzled driver asked as they crested a hill overlooking a valley where Silver Creek nestled between towering mountains. "Yes," Margaret said, adjusting her hat as wind whipped through the open window. "I'm to be married." The driver's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mail-order bride, then." "Well, best of luck to you. Silver Creek's a rough place for a lady." Margaret straightened her spine. "I'm prepared for hardship, sir," the driver chuckled. "We'll see about that, miss, we'll see." Silver Creek appeared first as a smudge on the horizon, then gradually took shape as a collection of weathered buildings straddling the banks of a winding creek. Margaret's heart pounded as the stagecoach rattled down the main street. Men in dusty clothes and wide-brimmed hats paused their activities to stare as the coach passed. Women were scarce in this part of the country, and a new female face was clearly a novelty. The coach lurched to a halt outside the general store, and Margaret gathered her courage as the driver opened the door. "Silver Creek," he announced. "End of the line, miss." Margaret descended carefully, holding her skirts above the mud. She scanned the small crowd that had gathered, looking for someone who might be her intended husband. Her advertisement reply had included a description: tall, with sandy hair and a scar along his left jaw, but no one matching that description approached. Instead, a young boy pushed through the onlookers. "You Miss Rose?" he asked, chewing on a piece of straw. "Yes," she replied, trying to maintain her composure despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Mr. Atwood sent me to fetch you. He's at the ranch, couldn't get away. I'm to take you there." Margaret glanced uncertainly at her trunk. "And my belongings?" "We'll load 'em on the wagon," the boy said, gesturing to a weathered farm wagon hitched to 2 tired-looking horses. The crowd of onlookers had grown, and Margaret felt their curious gazes. She heard whispers and muffled laughter as she followed the boy to the wagon. "That's her, Atwood's bride," a woman's voice carried clearly. "Too fancy for ranch life," another responded. "Bet she don't last a month," a man added, followed by more laughter. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her head high as she climbed awkwardly onto the wagon seat. The boy, who introduced himself as Tommy, handled the reins with surprising skill for someone who couldn't be more than 12. As they left town, the whispers and laughter of the townspeople faded, replaced by the creaking of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves. "Is it far to Mr. Atwood's ranch?" Margaret asked, attempting to smooth her wrinkled traveling dress. "About an hour," Tommy replied. "Big place. The Double-A Mr. Atwood's got the finest cattle herd in 3 counties. Margaret nodded, trying to picture the man she was to marry. His letters had been straightforward but kind, speaking of his ranch, his plans for the future, and his desire for a companionable wife. She had responded with equal honesty, sharing her background as the daughter of a professor, her skills at keeping accounts and maintaining a household, and her willingness to adapt to frontier life. What she hadn't mentioned was how desperate her circumstances had become, or how this marriage represented the last hope for her family's survival. The land stretched around them, vast and beautiful in its rugged way. Mountains loomed in the distance, and the grassy plains swayed in the wind. It was nothing like the crowded streets of Boston, and Margaret found herself both terrified and exhilarated by the openness. "There it is," Tommy announced finally, pointing toward a collection of buildings nestled in a small valley. The double ranch was larger than Margaret had anticipated. A sturdy two-story house stood at the center, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. Men on horseback moved in the distance, herding cattle across the valley floor. As they approached, several ranch hands stopped their work to watch. Margaret swallowed hard, straightening her back and adjusting her hat. First impressions mattered, especially here where she was already an outsider. Tommy pulled the wagon to a halt before the main house. Before Margaret could descend, the front door opened, and a man stepped onto the porch. He was tall as promised, with broad shoulders and sandy hair showing beneath his hat. A scar traced his jaw from ear to chin, but his expression was not the welcoming one she had hoped for. Instead, he looked stunned, almost dismayed. "Mr. Atwood." Margaret called, trying to keep her voice steady. The man approached slowly, his boots kicking up dust. "Miss Rose," he said, his voice deep but uncertain, "I wasn't expecting you today." "Your letter said to arrive on the 15th, Margaret replied, confusion and worry mingling in her chest. Benjamin Atwood ran a hand across his jaw. "So it did. I apologize. Things have been hectic." He glanced at the ranch hands who had gathered nearby, some openly gawking, others trying to hide their amusement. One of the men, a burly fellow with a thick mustache, whispered something that caused the others to burst into laughter. Margaret felt her face flush with humiliation. This was not the reception she had envisioned during those long days of travel. Benjamin's expression hardened as he turned to his men. "Back to work," he barked. The authority in his voice was unmistakable, and the men scattered, though some continued to cast glances over their shoulders. "Let me help you down," Benjamin said, approaching the wagon and offering his hand. Margaret hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip sure as he assisted her from the wagon. Even through her gloves, she could feel the strength in his hands. "Tommy, take Miss Rose's trunk to the guest room," Benjamin instructed. "Then see to the horses." "Yes, sir," Tommy replied, jumping down from the wagon. An awkward silence fell between them as they stood facing each other for the first time. Up close, Margaret could see that Benjamin's eyes were a clear blue, creased at the corners from squinting in the sun. His face was weathered but handsome in a rugged way, and the scar along his jaw looked like the result of a significant injury. "You must be tired after your journey," Benjamin said finally. "Come inside. Mrs. Cooper, our housekeeper, will have something prepared." Margaret followed him toward the house, acutely aware of the ranch hands who had returned to their tasks but continued to cast curious glances in her direction. The laughter still stung, and she wondered what about her arrival had caused such amusement. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable. Solid furniture, well crafted if not fancy, filled the rooms. Braided rugs covered portions of the wooden floors, and curtains softened the windows. It spoke of care and attention, not the bachelor quarters she had half expected. An older woman emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression was one of barely concealed surprise. "Mrs. Cooper, this is Miss Margaret Rose," Benjamin said. "My fiancée from Boston, Mrs." Cooper's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Is she now?" The housekeeper's gaze traveled from Margaret's fashionable traveling outfit to her polished shoes, clearly assessing. "Please prepare some refreshments," Benjamin said, his tone indicating this was not a request, as Mrs. Cooper retreated to the kitchen. Benjamin gestured toward the sitting room. "Please make yourself comfortable." Margaret perched on the edge of a chair, removing her gloves and hat. "Mr. Atwood, I sense that my arrival has caused some disruption." "If I've come at an inopportune time, no," Benjamin interrupted. "The timing it's fine, it's just that." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Miss Rose, I believe there may have been a misunderstanding." Margaret's heart sank. What sort of misunderstanding? Before Benjamin could respond, Mrs. Cooper returned with a tray bearing coffee and what looked like freshly baked biscuits. She set it down with more force than necessary and left without a word. Benjamin poured coffee for them both, his movements betraying a nervousness that increased Margaret's anxiety. "Miss Rose, please call me Margaret," she said, desperate to establish some connection. "Margaret," he nodded. "I want to be honest with you. When I placed that advertisement, I was seeking someone different." The words landed like a physical blow. "Different in what way?" Benjamin took a deep breath. "Someone more accustomed to ranch life, someone hardy, practical." Margaret set down her coffee cup with a steady hand, though inside she was trembling. "You specified an educated, respectable woman. That is what I am." "Yes, but—" His gaze dropped to her fine clothing, her delicate hands. "This isn't Boston. Life here is harsh, demanding. The work never ends." "You've clearly led a sheltered life, and sheltered." Margaret's voice rose slightly. "Mr. Atwood, since my father's death 2 years ago, I have managed a household of 5 on next to nothing. I've sold family heirlooms to buy food, sewn by candlelight to save on lamp oil, and taught piano to children I once called peers. I've watched my mother's health fail from worry and my sisters go hungry despite my best efforts." She paused, gathering herself. "I am not sheltered, sir. I am desperate." Benjamin stared at her, clearly taken aback by her outburst. Margaret continued, her voice lower but no less intense. "I sold everything I could to purchase passage here. There is nothing for me to return to. So if you find me unsuitable, I would appreciate knowing now, before I harbor any further illusions." A long silence stretched between them. Outside, the sounds of ranch life continued, men calling to each other, horses nickering, the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Benjamin spoke. "I apologize for my presumptions. It seems I've judged unfairly." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But you should know what you're agreeing to. This isn't just hard work, it's a different world. Most women who come out here either leave within months or—" He trailed off. "Or what?" Margaret prompted. "Or they break," he finished quietly. "The isolation, the hardship, the endless demands, it changes people." Margaret considered his words. "And yet you advertised for a wife." A faint smile touched his lips. "I did, foolishly, perhaps. May I ask why?" Benjamin hesitated, then gestured around them. "All this, the ranch, the cattle, the land, it needs a future. I've built something here, something that matters. But without family, without children to pass it to, what's the point?" Margaret nodded slowly. She understood the desire for legacy, for meaning beyond one's own existence. "So your laughter when I arrived wasn't my laughter," Benjamin corrected quickly. "My men were amused because—" "Well, because you look like you stepped out of a fashion plate, and they can't imagine someone like you mucking stalls or helping with calving." The corner of Margaret's mouth twitched. "I see, and you share their assessment." Benjamin met her gaze directly. "I've learned not to judge too quickly, Miss Rose, but I won't lie to you, I have doubts." Margaret set down her cup and stood, smoothing her skirts. "Then perhaps, Mr. Atwood, you should reserve judgment until you've seen what I'm capable of." She held his gaze, refusing to look away despite the hammering of her heart. "I didn't travel across half a continent to be dismissed before I've had a chance to prove myself." Something shifted in Benjamin's expression, surprise, perhaps, or reluctant admiration. He stood as well, towering over her. "Fair enough, Miss Rose. A trial period then. 2 weeks. If at the end of that time either of us feels this match is unsuitable, we part ways with no hard feelings." Margaret extended her hand. "Agreed, and I'll require work clothing. These garments are hardly suitable for ranch life." Benjamin took her hand, his grip firm but not crushing. "I'll have Mrs. Cooper show you to your room. We can discuss practical matters over dinner." As Margaret followed Mrs. Cooper up the stairs, she felt the weight of what she had agreed to. 2 weeks to prove herself capable of a life she knew almost nothing about. 2 weeks to secure her future and that of her family. And 2 weeks to determine if Benjamin Atwood, with his scarred face and guarded eyes, could ever see her as more than an obligation or a mistake. The guest room was simple but comfortable, a narrow bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the ranch yard. Margaret stood at that window after Mrs. Cooper left, watching the activity below. Men moved with purpose, each knowing their role in this complex operation. Soon she would need to find her place among them. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Tommy, struggling with her trunk. "Where would you like this, miss?" he asked, red-faced from the effort. "Just there is fine," Margaret said, pointing to a spot near the dresser. "Thank you, Tommy." The boy set down the trunk with a thud. "Mr. Atwood said to tell you supper's in an hour." He hesitated, shifting from foot to foot. "Is it true you're from Boston, with the big buildings and all?" Margaret smiled. "Yes, it's true." Tommy's eyes widened. "Why'd you come all the way out here then?" A good question, and one Margaret was still asking herself. "For a new beginning," she said finally. "Sometimes that's what people need." Tommy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, don't mind the men, they're not bad fellows, just ain't used to city ladies." He turned to go, then paused. "Mr. Atwood's a good man, miss, the best, even if he don't say much." After the boy left, Margaret opened her trunk and surveyed its contents. Beautiful dresses for a life she no longer led, delicate shoes unsuitable for ranch work. Books that had been her companions through dark times. At the bottom lay her most practical items: 2 sturdy work dresses she'd purchased for the journey, sensible boots, and a wide-brimmed hat for sun protection. She changed quickly, donning one of the work dresses. It was plain brown cotton, serviceable rather than attractive, but it would allow her to move freely. She braided her long chestnut hair and pinned it up, then studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her seemed different, already determined, a little afraid but resolute. This was who she needed to be now. When Margaret descended for dinner, she found Benjamin waiting at the foot of the stairs. His eyes widened slightly at her transformed appearance. "I see you came prepared after all," he said, his tone unreadable. "I'm adaptable, Mr. Atwood," Margaret replied. "A necessary quality, wouldn't you agree?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Indeed, dinner was a quiet affair, with Mrs. Cooper serving before retreating to the kitchen. The food was simple but abundant: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from what Margaret assumed was a kitchen garden. "Your home is lovely," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "Have you lived here long?" Benjamin nodded. 10 years, built most of it myself, and before that." He hesitated, cutting his meat with precise movements. "I fought in the war. After I came west, worked other men's ranches until I saved enough to start my own." "Your family?" Margaret asked gently. "Gone." The word was flat, final. "Yours?" Margaret described her mother and sisters, their life in Boston before her father's death, and their struggles after. She spoke of her father's passion for literature, his position at the university, and how quickly it had all unraveled when illness took him. "My mother was never strong," she explained. "And my sisters are still young, 16 and 14. They depend on me now. And they approved of your solution?" Benjamin asked, raising an eyebrow. Margaret met his gaze. "They know I would do whatever necessary to secure their future. The money you sent for my passage also paid our outstanding debts, and the arrangement we discussed in our letters included funds for their support." "I'll honor that commitment," Benjamin said immediately, "regardless of how things proceed between us." Relief washed through her. "Thank you." "That's very generous." "Not generous, honest." He set down his utensils. "I may have doubts about this arrangement, Miss Rose, but I keep my word." After dinner, Benjamin showed her around the main floor of the house, the sitting room she'd already seen, his small office where he kept the ranch accounts, the kitchen where Mrs. Cooper ruled, and a surprisingly well-stocked library. "My father's books," Margaret said softly, running her fingers along the spines. "I had to sell most of them." "These were my brother's," Benjamin replied. "He was the educated one, planned to be a lawyer before the war." Margaret heard the pain beneath the simple statement but knew better than to press. "May I borrow them sometimes?" "They're yours to read," Benjamin said. "Not much use to me these days." As evening fell, Margaret found herself standing on the porch with Benjamin, watching as the mountains turned purple against the darkening sky. The beauty of the place was undeniable, wild and vast in a way that made her feel simultaneously insignificant and somehow more alive. "It's overwhelming at first," Benjamin said, seemingly reading her thoughts, The space, the silence. Yes, Margaret agreed, but also, freeing in a way. He glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. Most city folk find it lonely. I imagine it can be both, Margaret said. Freeing and lonely at once. A comfortable silence fell between them. In the distance, a coyote called, its haunting cry echoing across the valley. Tomorrow, Benjamin said finally, I'll have Tommy show you around the ranch. You should understand what goes on here if you're to. If we're to determine if this arrangement can work, Margaret nodded. I'd like that. The men will stare, he warned. We don't get many visitors, especially women, but they'll behave themselves or answer to me. I'm not afraid of being stared at, Mr. Atwood. Benjamin, he said suddenly. If this trial period is to work, you should call me Benjamin. Benjamin, Margaret repeated, testing the name. Then I insist you call me Margaret. He nodded, and for a brief moment, Margaret thought she saw something warm flicker in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual reserved expression. Rest well, Margaret, he said, turning toward the door. Tomorrow will be a long day. Sleep came fitfully that night, despite her exhaustion. The unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the weight of uncertainty, and the memory of laughter when she'd arrived all conspired to keep Margaret awake. By the time dawn broke, painting the room with golden light, she had made a decision. She would not merely survive these 2 weeks, she would thrive. And she would show Benjamin Atwood and his men exactly what Margaret Rose was made of. The morning brought the scent of coffee and the sounds of the ranch awakening. Margaret, dressed in her work clothes, pulled on her sturdy boots and secured her hair beneath the wide-brimmed hat. When she descended to the kitchen, she found Mrs. Cooper already at work, kneading dough with forceful movements. Good morning, Margaret said brightly. Mrs. Cooper barely glanced up. Breakfast's on the table in the dining room. Mr. Atwood's already out with the men. Margaret hesitated. Is there anything I can help with? I'm quite capable in a kitchen. The older woman's hands stilled momentarily. This is my domain, Miss Rose, has been for 8 years. I don't need help. Understanding the territorial response, Margaret nodded. Of course. But should you ever want assistance rather than need it, I'd be happy to offer. Something in her wording made Mrs. Cooper look up, her expression speculative. We'll see, she said, neither acceptance nor rejection. Tommy's waiting for you on the porch after you eat. Breakfast was substantial eggs, bacon, biscuits, and strong coffee. Margaret ate heartily, knowing she would need her strength. Outside, Tommy waited as promised, his freckled face eager. Mr. Atwood says I'm to show you around, he announced importantly. Best start with the barn, I reckon. The tour was comprehensive. Tommy led her through the barn with its stalls for the working horses, the chicken coop where Mrs. Cooper collected eggs each morning, the smokehouse, the blacksmith's forge, and the bunkhouse where the ranch hands slept. Throughout the tour, men paused in their work to stare, some tipping their hats politely, others exchanging glances that Margaret pretended not to notice. And over there's where we brand the calves in spring, Tommy explained, pointing to a large corral. And that building's where we store grain for winter feed. Margaret absorbed it all, asking questions that made Tommy stand straighter with pride at his knowledge. The ranch was larger and more complex than she had imagined, a self-contained world with its own rhythms and rules. What about the garden? Margaret asked, noticing a fenced area behind the main house. That's Mrs. Cooper's territory, Tommy said with a grin. She grows vegetables and such, got some fruit trees too, though they don't always bear with the early frosts we get. As they walked, Margaret spotted Benjamin in the distance, mounted on a powerful black horse, directing several cowboys as they worked with a small herd of cattle. Even from afar, his authority was evident in the way the men responded to his signals. Mr. Atwood's the best rancher in the territory, Tommy said proudly, following her gaze. Started with just 50 head and now he's got over 500, bred for hardiness, he says. How long have you been here, Tommy? Margaret asked, the boy's expression sobered. 3 years. My pa was one of Mr. Atwood's men. When he died, Stampede got him. Mr. Atwood took me on, said I could stay as long as I worked hard and learned the business. His chest puffed slightly. Says I got a good head for cattle. Margaret was touched by the story and what it revealed about Benjamin's character. He seems like a good man to work for. The best, Tommy agreed immediately. Fair, and he don't hold with drinking or fighting among the men, says a ranch is only as good as the people running it. Their tour eventually led them back to the main house, where Mrs. Cooper was hanging laundry on a line stretching between two posts. The housekeeper eyed Margaret's dusty boots and wind-blown appearance with something that might have been approval. "Learn anything useful?" she asked. "A great deal," Margaret replied honestly, "though I expect there's much more to understand." Mrs. Cooper grunted, returning to her task. "Lunch is at noon. Mr. Atwood usually comes in then unless there's trouble with the herd." Rather than retreat to the house, Margaret stepped forward. "May I help with the laundry?" Mrs. Cooper hesitated, then thrust a handful of wooden clothespins at her. "Sheets need 2 pins each. Mind they don't drag in the dirt." Together they hung the remaining laundry, working in a silence that gradually became less strained. Margaret was no stranger to domestic work, and her efficient movements seemed to ease some of Mrs. Cooper's suspicion. "Been with Mr. Atwood long?" Margaret asked as they neared the end of the wash basket. "Since he built the house," Mrs. Cooper replied. "My husband was his foreman until the rheumatism got too bad. Now he handles the accounts in town and I keep the house." Margaret nodded. "It's a beautiful home. You've done well with it." Mrs. Cooper's weathered face softened slightly. "It's a good place, hard work, but good people." She fixed Margaret with a piercing look. "He needs a wife, that man, but one who can handle this life." The unspoken challenge hung between them. Margaret met the older woman's gaze steadily. "I intend to try, Mrs. Cooper, with all my heart." Something that might have been approval flickered in the housekeeper's eyes. "We'll see, girl, we'll see." At noon, Benjamin returned to the house, dusty from the morning's work. He found Margaret in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Cooper set the table despite the housekeeper's initial protests. "Tommy give you the tour?" he asked, washing his hands at the pump by the back door. "Yes, he's very knowledgeable," Margaret replied. "You have an impressive operation here." Benjamin accepted the towel she handed him, their fingers brushing momentarily. "It's taken years, still much to do." Over lunch, Benjamin explained more about the ranch, the breeding program he'd established, his plans for expanding the herd, the challenges of getting cattle to market with the nearest railhead 2 days' ride away. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her quick mind and genuine interest. Several times, she caught Benjamin looking at her with an expression of mild surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to grasp the business aspects so readily. "My father believed in educating his daughters as well as he would have educated sons," she explained when he commented on her understanding of his financial concerns. "And after his death, I managed what remained of his affairs." Benjamin nodded slowly. "Education's valuable out here too, though of a different sort sometimes." "I'm eager to learn," Margaret said simply. After lunch, Benjamin hesitated at the door. "I need to ride the north pasture this afternoon. Check the fences before we move the herd there." Margaret gathered her courage. "Could I come with you? I'd like to see more of the ranch." Benjamin's eyebrows rose. "It's a long ride, rough country." "I can ride," Margaret said. At his skeptical look, she added, "Perhaps not as well as you, but adequately. My grandfather kept horses outside Boston." Benjamin considered for a moment, then nodded. "All right, meet me at the barn in 15 minutes. Wear your hat, son's fierce today." Margaret hurried to change into her remaining work dress, a practical navy blue that would show dust less readily. By the time she reached the barn, Benjamin was saddling a second horse, a gentle-looking chestnut mare. "This is Penny," he said as Margaret approached. "She's steady, won't give you trouble." Several ranch hands paused in their work to watch as Benjamin helped Margaret mount. She settled into the saddle with more grace than they clearly expected, adjusting her skirts and taking the reins with confidence. One of the men, the burly one who had laughed the previous day, nudged another and muttered something that made them both smirk. Benjamin's head snapped up. "Something to share, Miller?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The man straightened immediately. "No, sir, just saying the lady sits a horse better than expected." "Miss Rose deserves the same respect you'd show any guest of mine," Benjamin said, his tone making it clear this was not a suggestion. "Or any lady, for that matter." The men sobered, nodding their acknowledgement. But as Benjamin mounted his black gelding and led Margaret away from the barn, she could feel their eyes on her back. Don't mind them, Benjamin said as they rode side by side across the open rangeland. They'll come around once they know you. If I stay, Margaret reminded him. Benjamin glanced at her. If you stay, he agreed. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to the vastness of the landscape. The ranch stretched for miles, it seemed, with the mountains standing guard in the distance. It's beautiful, Margaret said finally. Harsher than the east, but beautiful in its own way, Benjamin nodded. Took me a while to see it. When I first came west, I just saw opportunity. Land was cheap after the war, especially out here where most thought the soil too poor for farming. But good for cattle, Margaret observed. Good enough. Benjamin pointed to a distant ridge. Ranch boundary runs along there, got about 10,000 acres all told, some leased from the government, some purchased outright. Margaret tried to comprehend the scale. In Boston, families live entire lives on less than an acre. Benjamin chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. Different worlds. As they rode, Benjamin pointed out features of the land where the best grass grew, which water sources remained reliable even in drought years, the places where predators like wolves and mountain lions sometimes threatened the herd. Margaret listened and observed, building a mental map of this place that might become her home. They stopped to rest the horses near a small stream that cut through a stand of cottonwood trees. The shade was welcome after hours in the sun, and Margaret gratefully dismounted, feeling the stiffness in her legs. You ride well, Benjamin said, helping her down, though you'll be sore tomorrow. Likely, Margaret agreed with a smile, but worth it. They sat on the bank of the stream, listening to the water's gentle music. Benjamin pulled bread and cheese from his saddlebag, offering half to Margaret. Always carry food, he explained. Never know when you'll get back. They ate in comfortable silence, watching as their horses drank from the clear water. Margaret stole glances at Benjamin's profile, the strong jaw with its scar, the straight nose, the lines etched around his eyes from squinting against the sun and wind. He was handsome in a rugged way, nothing like the refined men she had known in Boston. How did you get the scar? She asked before she could stop herself. Benjamin's hand rose unconsciously to his jaw. Barbed wire. First year here, spooked horse, bad fall, wire fence caught me on the way down. He shrugged, could have been worse. Does it pain you still? Only in cold weather. His eyes met hers. Most things heal given time. Something in his tone made Margaret wonder if he spoke of more than physical wounds. She thought of his brief mentions of the war, his lost family, and sensed depths of experience she had yet to understand. Yes, she agreed softly, though sometimes they leave marks. Benjamin studied her face. What marks has life left on you, Margaret Rose, besides the obvious ones? Margaret considered the question. Caution, perhaps, a certain pragmatism my younger self would have disdained, and determination that's the deepest mark, I think. Determination's valuable out here, Benjamin said, more than beauty or education or fine manners. He paused. Though you seem to possess all those as well. The compliment, unexpected and matter-of-fact, brought warmth to Margaret's cheeks. Thank you. Benjamin looked away as if embarrassed by his own words. We should continue, still have the north fence to check before sundown. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a pattern of riding, dismounting to check fence posts and repair loose wires, then riding again. Margaret insisted on helping, holding tools and learning how to test if a post was secure. Her hands, soft from city life, soon bore scratches and smudges of dirt, but she made no complaint. The sun was low in the sky when they finally turned back toward the ranch house, casting long shadows across the grassland. Margaret's body ached from hours in the saddle, but her mind felt curiously at peace. There was something deeply satisfying about the physical work, the tangible results of their efforts. You did well today, Benjamin said as the buildings came into view. Most city folk would have complained or given up hours ago. I'm not most city folk, Margaret replied, and complaining rarely improves difficult situations. Benjamin's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile, a philosophy that serves well on a ranch. As they approached the barn, several cowboys gathered outside the bunkhouse watched their return. Margaret sat straighter in the saddle, ignoring her fatigue. She would not give them reason to doubt or mock her again. Miller, the man Benjamin had reprimanded earlier, stepped forward to take the horses as they dismounted. His eyes widened slightly as he noted Margaret's dusty clothing and hands that showed evidence of the day's work. "Dinner in an hour," Benjamin told her as they walked toward the main house. "You might want to rest before then." Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "Yes, I think I will." In her room, Margaret eased off her boots with a grateful sigh. Her muscles protested every movement and her hands stung from unaccustomed work. Yet beneath the discomfort lay a curious satisfaction. She had survived her first full day at the Double Ranch. More than survived, she had participated, contributed in some small way. She washed as best she could with the water in her basin, changed into a fresh dress simpler than her Boston attire but still respectable, and brushed out her wind-tangled hair. The face that looked back from the mirror was flushed from sun and exertion, her eyes bright with something that might have been purpose. When she descended for dinner, Benjamin was waiting in the sitting room, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He looked up at her approach and something flickered in his eyes, appreciation, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "You look rested," he said, rising. "Appearances can be deceiving," Margaret replied with a small smile. Every muscle protests movement. The corner of Benjamin's mouth twitched. "It gets easier. Eventually." Dinner was a more relaxed affair than the previous night, with Benjamin speaking more freely about the ranch and his plans for its future. Margaret found herself drawn into the conversation, offering observations from her day's experiences and asking questions that revealed her quick understanding. "You have a good mind for business," Benjamin commented as they discussed his strategy for expanding the herd. "My father believed women capable of rational thought despite popular opinion," Margaret said dryly. "He encouraged me to read widely and question everything. A progressive man, yes, not always popular among his colleagues but steadfast in his beliefs." Margaret smiled at the memory. "He would have liked you, I think." "Oh," Benjamin raised an eyebrow, "you're straightforward. He valued honesty above social graces." Benjamin considered this. "And you, what do you value, Margaret?" She met his gaze. "Integrity, kindness. The courage to build something meaningful in an uncertain world." She paused. "And you?" "Similar things," Benjamin said after a moment. "Hard work, loyalty, truth, even when it's difficult." His eyes held hers. "And second chances." The words hung between them, layered with meaning neither was quite ready to articulate. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching twilight deepen across the valley. The day's heat yielded to a pleasant coolness, and stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. "I've never seen so many stars," Margaret said softly. "In Boston, the city lights obscure most of them." "One benefit of isolation," Benjamin replied. "You see things more clearly out here, the important things." They sat in companionable silence as full darkness fell. In the distance, a coyote called, answered by another farther away. "You should know," Benjamin said finally, "that Miller and some of the men have a wager." Margaret turned to look at him. "A wager on how long you'll last." His expression was apologetic. "I've forbidden it, but that doesn't mean it's not happening." Margaret felt a flush of anger, quickly followed by determination. "And what are the terms of this wager?" Benjamin hesitated. "Most don't think you'll make it past the week. Miller's given you 3 days. And you?" Margaret asked quietly. "What would you wager if you were a betting man?" Benjamin met her gaze, his eyes serious in the dim light. "I'd bet on you surprising them all. You're stronger than they think." The simple statement warmed her more than any elaborate compliment could have. "Thank you for telling me. You deserve to know." Benjamin rose from his chair. "Rest well, Margaret. Tomorrow brings new challenges." Margaret slept deeply that night despite her aching body, the physical exhaustion overwhelming her anxieties. She woke to rooster crows and the early stirrings of the ranch, her muscles protesting as she climbed from bed. After washing and dressing in her work clothes, she made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Cooper already busy in the kitchen. "Morning," the housekeeper said, her tone marginally less frosty than before. "Mr. Atwood's already out, said to tell you to eat and then find him at the corral if you're feeling up to it." Margaret smiled. I'm feeling perfectly capable, thank you. Mrs. Cooper eyed her skeptically. Most city folk can barely move after their first day in the saddle. I didn't say I wasn't sore, Margaret clarified, just that I'm capable. Something like approval flickered in the older woman's eyes. Breakfast is on the table. And there's liniment in the pantry if you need it for those muscles. After breakfast, Margaret found Benjamin at the main corral where several cowboys were working with young horses. She approached cautiously, mindful of the unpredictable animals. Benjamin spotted her and came to the fence. "Didn't expect you so early," he said, taking in her practical attire and determined expression. "How are you feeling? Ready for today's challenges?" Margaret replied, refusing to acknowledge the stiffness in her limbs. "What can I learn this morning?" For the next week, Margaret threw herself into ranch life with a determination that gradually won the respect of the household and hands alike. Each day brought new tasks and lessons helping Mrs. Cooper preserve fruits from the garden, learning to recognize the signs of illness in cattle, practicing with a lariat under Tommy's enthusiastic instruction, even assisting Benjamin with the ranch accounts one rainy afternoon. Her hands grew calloused, her skin tanned despite her hat, and her confidence in this new environment steadily increased. The laughter that had greeted her arrival faded, replaced by cautious acceptance from most of the cowboys. Only Miller maintained his skepticism, watching her with narrowed eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Margaret heard through Tommy that the man had lost money on his wager and blamed her personally for his embarrassment. The relationship between Margaret and Benjamin evolved as well, moving from cautious assessment to something approaching partnership. They talked more freely in the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts and thoughts about the future. Margaret learned of Benjamin's childhood in Virginia, his reluctant service in the Confederate Army despite personal misgivings about slavery, and his determination to build something honorable after the war's devastation. "I came west to start clean," he explained one evening as they sat before the fire. "No one here cared which side you fought for, only whether you worked hard and dealt fairly." Margaret shared more of her own history, her sheltered upbringing, her father's progressive views on women's education, the shock of poverty after his death, and her desperate decision to become a mail-order bride. "I wrote to my mother after I arrived," she confessed. "Told her I was safely married and settled." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "A bit premature, perhaps," Margaret sighed. "I couldn't bear for her to worry, and am determined to make this work." The unspoken question hung between them: was it working? Were they compatible enough to forge a life together? The 2-week trial period was nearing its end, and neither had raised the subject directly. On the 10th day, disaster struck. Margaret was helping Mrs. Cooper in the garden when Tommy came running, face pale with urgency. "Miss Margaret." "Come quick, Mr. Atwood's hurt." Margaret dropped her basket, heart racing as she followed Tommy toward the barn. A small crowd had gathered around the corral where Benjamin sat on the ground, his face contorted with pain. "What happened?" Margaret demanded, pushing through the men. "New stallion threw him," one of the hands explained. "Caught his leg bad against the fence post." Benjamin looked up as Margaret knelt beside him, his face gray beneath his tan. "It's nothing," he ground out. "Just need a minute." Margaret ignored the protest, carefully examining his right leg. The boot was already swelling and the angle of the ankle looked wrong. "It's broken," she said firmly. "We need to get you to the house." She looked up at the gathered men. "I need 4 of you to carry him, carefully." Miller stepped forward, skepticism on his face. "Now see here, miss, Mr. Atwood doesn't do as she says," Benjamin interrupted, his voice strained but authoritative. "Now." With reluctant care, 4 men lifted Benjamin and carried him to the house, following Margaret's instructions. Once inside, they placed him on the sofa while Margaret gathered supplies: hot water, clean cloths, scissors, and the whiskey from Benjamin's office. "Everyone out," she commanded. "Except you," she added, pointing to the most senior hand, a weathered man named Jackson. "I'll need help with the boot." The men filed out, casting concerned glances at their boss. Only Miller hesitated. "Someone should fetch the doctor from town," he said. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "Tommy can ride fastest. Tell him to hurry." Once the room cleared, Margaret turned her attention to Benjamin, whose face was now beaded with sweat. "This will hurt," she warned, handing him the whiskey bottle. "Drink." Benjamin took a long swallow, then gripped the sofa arm as Margaret and Jackson carefully removed his boot. The ankle was already swelling dramatically, the skin discolored. "Clean break, I think," Margaret said, gently probing the injury, "but we'll need to set it before the doctor arrives." Benjamin's eyes widened. "You've set bones before." "My father's arm once," Margaret replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "And my sister's finger. The principle is the same: straighten and immobilize." Benjamin held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it." Margaret turned to Jackson. "I need straight pieces of wood for splints and rope or cloth for binding." While the man hurried to collect the items, Margaret carefully cut away Benjamin's pant leg, exposing the injury fully. The break was clean but needed realignment. "More whiskey," she advised Benjamin. "This will be unpleasant." Benjamin's laugh was strained. "You have a gift for understatement." When Jackson returned with the supplies, Margaret positioned him at Benjamin's shoulders. "Hold him steady." Taking a deep breath, Margaret grasped Benjamin's foot and ankle firmly. "Ready?" she asked, meeting his eyes. Benjamin nodded once, his jaw tight. With a swift, decisive movement, Margaret pulled and twisted, feeling the bones grate and then align with a sickening sound. Benjamin's entire body went rigid, a guttural groan escaping through clenched teeth before he fell back, breathing heavily. "Done," Margaret said, quickly positioning the wooden splints around the ankle and binding them securely. Her hands were steady despite the pounding of her heart, and the knowledge that Benjamin's pain was by her doing, necessary though it was. When she finished, she looked up to find Benjamin watching her, his eyes clearer despite the pain. "Thank you," he said simply. Margaret shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. The doctor may need to redo everything." Benjamin reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "You did well." The simple praise, given despite his pain, touched Margaret deeply. She squeezed his hand briefly before rising to her feet. "Jackson, please help me move Mr. Atwood to his bedroom. He'll be more comfortable there while waiting for the doctor." With careful maneuvering, they managed to get Benjamin upstairs and settled on his bed. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed, a chest of drawers, and a desk near the window overlooking the ranch yard. "I'll send Mrs. Cooper up with tea and something for the pain," Margaret said, turning to go. "Margaret," Benjamin called, stopping her at the door. "Stay." "Please," she hesitated, then nodded to Jackson. "Thank you for your help. I'll call if we need anything else." After the cowboy left, Margaret returned to Benjamin's side. "You should rest." Benjamin's expression was serious despite the lines of pain around his mouth. "I need to tell you something first." Margaret sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "What is it?" "The ranch," Benjamin said, struggling to sit straighter. "If I'm laid up, someone needs to oversee things. Jackson's a good man, but he's not a manager." "Surely Miller or one of the other hands know," Benjamin said firmly. "I need someone I trust, someone with a stake in this place." His eyes held hers. "I need you, Margaret." The simple statement hung between them, layered with meanings neither was ready to fully acknowledge. "Benjamin, I've only been here 10 days. I barely understand. You understand more than you think," he interrupted. "You learn quickly, you see clearly, and the men respect you after what you just did." A faint smile touched his lips. Even Miller's impressed, though he'd never admit it. Margaret took a deep breath. "You're asking a lot, I know." Benjamin's expression softened. "Our 2-week trial isn't over. If you want to leave, I understand. But if you stay, if you choose this place, these people—" "If I choose you," Margaret said quietly, completing the thought. Benjamin nodded, not looking away. "Yes." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and uncertainty. Then Margaret straightened her shoulders, decision made. "Tell me what needs doing," she said. "Start with the most urgent tasks." Relief flooded Benjamin's face, followed by something warmer. "The cattle in the north pasture need moving tomorrow. Water's getting low there. Jackson knows the plan, but he'll need authorization." Margaret nodded, mentally making notes. "What else?" For the next hour, Benjamin outlined the ranch operations, priorities, and potential problems. Margaret listened carefully, asking questions and absorbing the information with focused attention. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the doctor, a harried-looking man who seemed surprised to find Benjamin already splinted and comfortable. "Fine work," he commented after examining the ankle. "Military experience, common sense, and necessity," Margaret replied. The doctor nodded approvingly. "Well, it's a clean break, should heal well if he stays off it." He glanced at Benjamin. "Which means complete rest for at least 3 weeks, Atwood. No arguments." Benjamin's expression darkened. 3 weeks. "Doc, the fall roundup is coming, and it will happen without you on a horse," the doctor interrupted firmly. "Unless you want to risk permanent damage." After the doctor left, Benjamin sat in frustrated silence, staring out the window at his ranch, the ranch he could no longer actively manage for weeks. "It will be all right," Margaret said quietly. "Between Jackson, the men, and myself, we'll handle things." Benjamin turned to look at her, his expression softening. "I know, it's just—" He gestured helplessly. "Difficult to rely on others when you're accustomed to doing everything yourself," Margaret finished. "I understand better than you might think." Benjamin studied her face. "I believe you do." The following days established a new routine at the Double A Ranch. Each morning, Margaret met with Jackson to discuss the day's work. She reviewed the accounts, approved expenses, and made decisions on Benjamin's behalf. In the afternoons, she reported to Benjamin, discussing problems and seeking his advice while carefully ensuring he felt consulted rather than sidelined. The Cowboys, after initial skepticism, gradually accepted her authority, partly out of respect for Benjamin, partly due to her own growing competence, but largely because of the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. Even Miller's attitude shifted from open disdain to grudging respect after Margaret personally helped him, and 3 other men free a cow trapped in mud during a sudden downpour. Soaked to the skin and covered in muck, she had worked alongside them without complaint, earning a brief nod of acknowledgement from the surly cowboy, Mrs. Cooper, too, seemed to accept Margaret's place in the household, including her in discussions about supplies and even teaching her to make Benjamin's favorite cornbread. "He's different with you here," the housekeeper commented one afternoon as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "Lighter somehow?" Margaret focused on kneading dough, unsure how to respond. "His leg is healing well. That must ease his mind," Mrs. Cooper snorted. "It's not his leg that's healing, girl." The relationship between Margaret and Benjamin deepened during his convalescence. Forced to remain indoors, he had time for conversations they might never have had otherwise. They discussed books from his library, debated politics, and shared stories of their childhoods. In the evenings, Margaret sometimes read aloud while Benjamin whittled a hobby she hadn't known he possessed. "My father taught me," he explained, hands moving deftly despite his injury. "Said a man should create something beautiful, not just useful." Margaret watched as a wooden horse gradually emerged from the block in his hands. "He was wise, your father, in some ways." Benjamin's expression grew distant. Not wise enough to avoid ruin when the war came, he lost everything defending a cause he came to doubt. "And yet he raised sons who could build anew," Margaret observed softly. Benjamin's eyes met hers. "One son. My brother didn't come home." Margaret reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. "I'm sorry." Benjamin turned his palm upward, intertwining their fingers. The simple contact felt more intimate than any words. 16 days, he said quietly. Margaret looked up, confused. "What? You've been here 16 days. Our 2-week trial period has passed." His eyes held hers. "You never mentioned leaving." Margaret's heart quickened. "You never mentioned wanting me to stay." "I thought it was obvious." Benjamin's thumb traced circles on her palm. "This place is better with you in it. I'm better with you here." Margaret took a shaky breath. "Is this a formal offer, Mr. Atwood?" The corner of Benjamin's mouth lifted. "It is, Miss Rose. I'm asking you to stay, as my wife, if you're willing." Joy bubbled up inside her, but Margaret contained it, needing clarity. "Because I've proven useful." "Or because of something more?" Benjamin set aside his carving and took both her hands in his. "Both," he said honestly. "You are remarkably capable, Margaret Rose, but more importantly, you bring light to places that were dark for too long. You make this house a home. You make me want things I'd stopped believing possible." What things? Margaret whispered. Family, children, a future that's about more than just surviving or building a business. His grip tightened. Happiness. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I came here desperate and afraid with nothing but determination and pride I never expected. To find a home, Benjamin suggested. To find you, Margaret corrected. Someone I could respect, admire, and she hesitated, then finished with simple honesty. Love. The word hung between them, new and fragile and true. Benjamin's expression softened into something Margaret had rarely seen: vulnerability mixed with hope. Is that a yes, then? Margaret smiled through her tears. It's a yes, Benjamin Atwood. I would be honored to be your wife. Benjamin pulled her gently toward him, mindful of his injured leg. His lips found hers in a kiss that began tentatively but deepened as Margaret responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. When they finally parted, both were breathing quickly, eyes bright with emotion and promise. When? Benjamin asked. How soon can we marry? Margaret laughed softly at his eagerness. The doctor said 3 weeks of rest, perhaps when you're fully recovered. Too long, Benjamin declared. The circuit preacher comes through town next week. We could marry then if you're willing. A week. Margaret's eyes widened. But there's so much to prepare. What do we need besides each other and a few witnesses? Benjamin asked pragmatically. Unless you want to wait for a fancy dress and guests who'd never make it this far anyway. Margaret considered his words. Her family was too far away to attend regardless of timing, and her heart was already committed, had been perhaps since the moment she decided to stay and help during his injury. Next week then, she agreed, though I'll need to write to my mother and sisters. They should know I've found happiness, not just security. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch. Mrs. Cooper immediately began planning a special dinner for after the ceremony, while Jackson organized the men to build a proper wedding arch beside the house. Even Miller contributed, offering to ride to town for supplies and fabric for a new dress if Margaret wished. Seems our engagement has united the ranch, Margaret observed as she and Benjamin sat on the porch watching the preparations. His leg, propped on a stool, was healing well, though he still required a crutch to move about. You've won them over, Benjamin said, pride evident in his voice. Even the ones who bet against you. Margaret smiled mischievously. Speaking of which, who won that wager? Someone must have bet I would stay. Tommy, Benjamin admitted with a chuckle. Said from the first day you had grit enough for 10 cowgirls. His words, not mine. Smart boy, Margaret said. We should do something special for him. Already planned, Benjamin replied. I've set aside money for his education when he's ready. Boy has a good mind, should have opportunities beyond ranch work. Margaret's heart swelled at this evidence of Benjamin's generosity. You're a good man, Benjamin Atwood. He captured her hand, bringing it to his lips. Trying to be worthy of my bride. The week passed in a flurry of preparation and anticipation. Mrs. Cooper and Margaret worked together to transform one of Margaret's dresses into something suitable for a wedding, adding lace from the housekeeper's own treasured collection. Was my mother's, Mrs. Cooper explained gruffly as she handed over the delicate fabric. Seems fitting it should adorn a bride again. Margaret was touched by the gesture, recognizing it as acceptance into this close-knit community. Thank you, I'll cherish it. On the morning of the wedding, Margaret woke with the sun, her heart full of quiet certainty. The journey that had begun in desperation had led her to this day, this place, this man. Whatever hardships lay ahead, and ranch life guaranteed there would be many, they would face them together. Mrs. Cooper helped her dress and arranged her hair, working with unexpected gentleness. You look beautiful, the housekeeper said when they finished, her usual gruffness softened by emotion. He's a fortunate man. I'm the fortunate one, Margaret replied honestly. The ceremony took place beneath the arch the Cowboys had constructed, adorned with wildflowers gathered by Tommy. The ranch hands stood in a respectful semicircle, freshly shaved and wearing their best clothes. Benjamin waited beneath the arch, leaning slightly on his crutch but standing tall, his face alight with happiness as Margaret approached. The circuit preacher, a weathered man accustomed to performing marriages under unusual circumstances, spoke the traditional words with quiet dignity. When it came time for the vows, Benjamin set aside his crutch to take both of Margaret's hands in his. "Margaret Rose," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I take you as my wife, promising to cherish and protect you all the days of my life. What I have is yours, this land, this home, my heart. I will be faithful and true, a partner in all things, until death parts us." Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she responded. "Benjamin Atwood, I take you as my husband, promising to stand beside you through all that life brings. I offer you my strength, my loyalty, my love. I will share your burdens and your joys, a partner in all things, until death parts us." The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Benjamin kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Around them, the cowboys cheered and whooped, their earlier skepticism forgotten in the genuine happiness of the moment. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food, music from an unexpected quartet of cowboys who produced fiddles and harmonicas, and dancing despite Benjamin's injured leg. Margaret moved among the men, accepting congratulations and teasing with a confidence that would have astonished her just weeks earlier. As twilight descended, Benjamin found her at the edge of the gathering, watching as Tommy attempted to teach Mrs. Cooper a lively dance step. "Happy?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Margaret leaned into him, savoring his warmth and strength. "Completely, and you, more than I believed possible." He kissed her temple. "Ready to escape this celebration?" Margaret smiled up at him. "Lead the way, husband." They slipped away to the house, Benjamin managing the stairs with determined grace despite his healing ankle. In their bedroom now, truly theirs, candles had been lit and wildflowers placed in a jar beside the bed. Margaret recognized Mrs. Cooper's thoughtful touch. "Nervous?" Benjamin asked softly as he set aside his crutch. Margaret shook her head. "No, this feels right, like coming home after a long journey." Benjamin drew her into his arms. "You are home, Margaret, and so am I." Their first night together as husband and wife was a tender discovery, each learning the other with reverent hands and whispered words of love. Margaret, who had once feared this aspect of marriage, found only joy in Benjamin's touch and in the intimate connection they shared. Later, lying in the circle of his arms with moonlight streaming through the window, Margaret thought of the journey that had brought her here from desperate mail-order bride met with laughter to respected wife and partner. "What are you thinking?" Benjamin asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "About beginnings," Margaret replied, "and how the most difficult paths sometimes lead to the most beautiful destinations." Benjamin's arms tightened around her. "I'm grateful every day that you had the courage to travel that path." "I had little choice," Margaret admitted, "but I would choose it again, knowing where it led." The years that followed brought both joys and hardships to the Double-A Ranch. The cattle business prospered under their joint management, with Margaret's keen mind for figures complementing Benjamin's practical knowledge. When Benjamin's leg healed, they worked side by side, earning the respect of ranchers throughout the territory. Their family grew with the birth of a daughter the following year, a strong-willed child they named Eleanor after Benjamin's mother. 2 years later, a son joined the family, named Thomas in honor of the boy who had first welcomed Margaret to the ranch. Tommy himself became like an older brother to the children, eventually accepting Benjamin's offer to fund his education at a Denver school. Mrs. Cooper remained with them, becoming Grandma Cooper to the children and a treasured friend to Margaret. Even Miller, once so skeptical, became one of the ranch's most loyal hands, eventually marrying a widow from town and establishing a small homestead on land Benjamin helped him purchase. Through droughts, harsh winters, and the inevitable challenges of frontier life, Benjamin and Margaret faced each obstacle together, their partnership only strengthening with time. The laughter that had once mocked Margaret's arrival became the joyful laughter of a household filled with love and purpose. On their 10th anniversary, Benjamin presented Margaret with a special gift, a small carved wooden box containing the deed to the ranch, now bearing both their names. "It was always yours in my heart," he explained as she traced the document with trembling fingers. "But I wanted it official. This place exists because of both of us." Margaret closed the box carefully and placed it on the table before turning to embrace her husband. Thank you. Though the greatest gift was always you, your trust, your respect, your love. Benjamin's hands framed her face, his eyes as blue and clear as the day she'd agreed to be his wife. Do you ever regret it? Coming west, marrying a scarred rancher with nothing but dreams and determination. Margaret smiled up at him, her heart as full as it had been on their wedding day. Never, not for a single moment. As twilight settled over the Double Ranch, Benjamin and Margaret Atwood stood on the porch of the home they had built together, watching their children play in the yard. Their hands were clasped, fingers intertwined in the familiar, comfortable way of a couple who had weathered much and grown stronger for it. "Remember what you said to me once?" Benjamin asked softly. "About how the most difficult paths sometimes lead to the most beautiful destinations." Margaret nodded, leaning against his shoulder. "I remember. You were right," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "and I'm grateful every day that your path led you here." "As am I," Margaret replied, her voice rich with contentment. "As am I." In the distance, the mountains stood sentinel as they had for countless years, witnesses to the story of a mail-order bride who had arrived with nothing but determination and pride, and found a love that would last a lifetime.